I think that a lot of our veterans and veteran community, while they do have mental health issues, it might not always be tied to their experience in the military, or it might be tied to something that happened while they were in the military but wasn't on duty. Um, so I think that that's something really important to point out because veterans have a really high suicide rate. It's about 22 a day. Um, and a lot of that comes from having prior, like, adverse childhood experiences doubled with their experience in the military.
Welcome to the place where we hear empowering stories of transformation and then we turn that into art that reminds us to be great. I am your host and artist, Jessica James, and this is the I Empower podcast. All right. Thank you so much, Anita, for being with me today. I'm really excited to get to talk to you because you actually have been a follower of my art page for I don't even know how long now, and you're always so kind and you're always so supportive in my DMs. And then when I did a call for podcast guests, you were like, hey, I think I have a story that I want to tell. And I was like, let's do it. So I always like to tell my listeners and my viewers where I find my guests. So we have been connected for, I feel like it's been a few years now. So
I feel like it's been like 3 or 4, maybe more. I don't know.
Yeah,
It's been way before you
been...
had your youngest. So.
Oh, yeah. So like for a while now, you've been with me from like the start, I feel like. So I am interested. Do you remember like how you found me? Like what made you be like, I want to follow this girl?
So I grew up in North Carolina, and we had some like mutual connections somewhere along the way. And I found you in another company that was woman owned, and you were both about my age. And I thought that it was really interesting that it looked like we graduated about the same time in the same like geographical area, and you were creating this really incredible art because still at that point I think you were still doing some like stage props and stuff.
Yes. Oh
so
my gosh.
Just getting to see you like grow in your art has been so cool.
Oh my God. I feel like my cheeks are flushing. I'm like, oh my goodness. Yeah. So you've been around for a while. It's always interesting when first of all, how the internet connects people. Like, I think it's an incredible thing. And
Right?
being able to watch someone grow, like this is the first time I've heard anyone actually like say that to me that has been with me from like that point and see. So thank you so much for that. That just made my day.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about you.
Glad.
Let's talk about you. Okay. I want to talk about you. You have a very touching story, a very powerful one. I'm going to hand the mic over to you and just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. So I am 28, fixing to be 29. I'm an Air Force veteran. I joined shortly after I graduated from high school. Not directly after, but shortly after. I met my husband while I was in the Air Force. And when we got out of the Air Force, we moved to the big Midwest of Oklahoma. Which I had never been across the Mississippi River before. And now we have 2 kids, and we've been in Oklahoma for 7, 8 years now, which was not the plan originally. I am in law school. I have my undergrad in deaf education. I taught for about a year before I decided that I wanted to do something more with my degree than just teach, because advocacy was really where my heart was. And so I work at a university and I go to school part-time now. We'll be full-time soon. So.
Oh my gosh, that's so incredible. And so, what made you choose Air Force out of high school?
So I went to college for a semester, which was not quite what I needed it to be. I was dealing with some personal stuff, and I had lost a really good friend of mine at the end of my senior year, and I didn't really know how to cope with it. So I wound up partying a lot more than I should have. And about Thanksgiving time, I decided to call a couple of recruiters. I took my ASVAB. I talked to the Marines, the Army, and the Air Force. Both of my parents were in the Army, so they were like, "No, don't do that."
Don't do
And
it.
the difference in the Air Force and the Marine Corps was essentially whenever I was going to leave and what my job was going to be. And I figured out that I had more options with the Air Force. And so I um, signed a contract with them and left May of 2012. So in about 15-ish days, it'll be 10 years ago. So
Wow. My brother joined the army around, I feel terrible for not really knowing the dates that he did that, but he joined the army, and then next thing we knew, he was being deployed to Kuwait and then Iraq as well. And that was terrifying. Did you ever get deployed?
I did not. I wrote orders for deployments, which was kind of hard sometimes. But as far as being deployed, I was never deployed, so I had no combat experience.
I gotcha. So, what was that experience and in general for you being in that community, being in that field? Just, I can't even imagine, honestly, what it takes to serve a country, but then being like, you know, I don't know a lot about it, but I could imagine it could weigh a lot on you. And there are a lot of people that come out of that who suffer with you had mentioned
Yeah.
PTSD and just a menagerie of mental health struggles.
Yeah.
What was that like for you?
So I my enlistment was pretty easy. I was only in for about 2 years because I got hurt during training and messed up my hip pretty bad, so I was coded non-deployable. And in 2014, the Air Force kicked about 100,000 personnel out because it was too big in the middle. Um, and I was part of that force management. Which I was pretty okay with. I came out with my GI Bill and all of the like benefits in the long run. What I found to be the hardest is I didn't know that because of childhood trauma, what was going on with my brain. And whenever I got in, something got triggered. And I had my very first panic attack while I was in. And I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety then, which has since been transitioned over to PTSD. But most of my like mental health stuff has come from before the military, which I think is really important to share because everybody hears veteran and PTSD and they immediately put those two experiences together. Um,
Yeah,
and a lot of people don't think about the fact that people outside of the military have PTSD for reasons not combat related, because we put a big
right.
emphasis on that. Um, I think that a lot of our veterans and veteran community, while they do have mental health issues, it might not always be tied to their experience in the military, or it might be tied to something that happened while they were in the military but wasn't on duty. Um, so I think that that's something really important to point out because veterans have a really high suicide rate. It's about 22 a day. Um, and a lot of that comes from having prior, like, adverse childhood experiences doubled with their experience in the military. So I always like to talk about that.
Yeah, most definitely. You know, especially with the word PTSD, before I even started this project, you know, someone asked me recently what mental health meant to me or mental illness meant to me. And my response was, you know, before this project, you hear about the big words, you hear depression, you hear anxiety, you hear PTSD, and they're always, you know, for me, again, being ignorant in the beginning of this project, I always looked at it as like it had to be this catastrophic event that happened to somebody, especially with the word PTSD. It's always associated with wars and like, you know, violent crimes or these horrific things that happen to people. But, you know, the more I talk to people I don't know if it's just like because there isn't that much awareness about it. but realizing that like how the brain reacts to certain traumas, it can be triggered in different ways. And there's like complex PTSD, and then there's just, regular PTSD, and how, like you said, I think it is important, especially for veterans, because that was the first thing I thought when you told me PTSD, even feeling like I have a decent knowledge of mental illness and mental health. When you said PTSD, you're an Air Force veteran, I'm thinking you went to combat or you had a major injury that happened and that caused all these things. But like putting that highlight on that, it's not always, it's so complex. There's so much that goes along with it, and really, truly helping the
Absolutely.
veterans, for those that served, and offering help like that. So, you mentioned the suicide rates. What is help after being in the Army and serving in the force? What does that look like for you? Is there any kind of like, I know that there is the VA that I hear a lot of people talk about, but like, as far as like actual, it's almost like I think of briefing, like, and again, this is my ignorance of not knowing much about service. You get briefed for a mission. Like, do they debrief you? Do they check on you afterwards? Like, what does that look like?
So the VA itself is there as an entity. The VA in Oklahoma is not the best, which is part of why I am in law school. I've had to fight a lot. I actually had to pay $15,000 out of my own pocket for a surgery that was service connected because the VA refused to give it to me in 2020. So the VA is an interesting entity. I do receive mental health services through the VA, but we also have a couple of nonprofits here in Tulsa, one of which is the Vet Center, which they have in pretty much every metropolitan now, and that is a mental health organization specifically for combat veterans. And that was founded by Vietnam Veterans of America because Vietnam veterans have a really hard time with allowing themselves to be comfortable with the VA. So it is a separate entity that keeps their medical records separate from the VA medical records to protect them. And they have just kept going and kept their doors open for every generation since then. So a lot of my students that I work with, because I do work with veteran students, a lot of my students that I work with, if I find out that they have combat experience, I'll send them there. Just because they have more availability, they have more resources, and they're not waiting a huge, long wait. Like right now, it's about 15 weeks to get in to see a mental health provider at the VA. And that's if you already have an established mental health provider. So to me, that's egregious, but we have a counseling service on campus that I send students to. And then we've got several counselors and therapists and psychologists here in town that are willing to work with you too. So.
Oh, awesome. And this is something that is specific to your area, right? How beneficial would this be if we could have something like this everywhere?
So the vet center itself is a nationwide thing. So I think that there's a vet center in Charlotte. There might be one in Raleigh.
Okay.
But like I had somebody reach out to me about somebody that was in Kansas. So I looked up where their vet center was. It's just not a resource that a lot of people know about more than anything.
Okay. Yeah.
And I feel like in my capacity, getting to know like different people within my community because of being within like the veteran subsect of our community has given me the opportunity to make some of the like backdoor like connections. So I feel like if veterans need help and they're listening to this, then they should get in touch with a local college's Veterans Services Center, or reach out to the Vet Center, or find me on Instagram. I think it's AKOD_1208. And I will
we'll link that
hook you up
definitely too to the show notes.
I am willing to help whoever. So.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. That's so awesome. Because I am, I was passionate about I'm passionate about everybody's health and especially mental health. But definitely for those who have, like you said, been in combat, I can't even begin to imagine what it would be like to be in an environment like that. But, you hear a lot about how the healthcare for the veterans, that there's definitely some holes in the system that need to be fixed. And so, is this the reason why, like your experience, is this the reason why you are pursuing your degree?
So I, because of my injury to my hip while I was in, I wound up having a cane for 3 years. And at 25 years old, getting a cane was one of the most like mentally stressful things for me. And that was more because how people perceive you is how they perceive you. And I am a 4'11", tiny 100-pound female. Um, and I like to be perceived as kind of a force to be reckoned with whenever I enter a
Hmm.
room, especially whenever it comes to my professional status. And the day that I got my cane, I went to get my nails done at a place that I have gone and gotten my nails done at since I was an undergrad. And they like ran to the door and they held the door open for me and they made all of these like extra concessions. And I thought that that was really interesting because I have never had anybody like outwardly realize that something is wrong with my body. Because normally they look at me and go,
Right.
"Oh, you're just a 20 something. I look really young."
Yeah.
Um, so normally I get just like brushed off. I get ID'd all the time, whatever. So that was kind of an eye opening day for me. But the days before that were much more eye opening. So whenever I graduated from college in 2018, I got a job teaching at a school district in South Texas. I was an itinerant teacher of the deaf. I had 8 students across 5 schools from 3 years old to eighth grade. Um, and my administration told me that I was not allowed to teach them sign language because that didn't make them normal enough. We weren't allowed to send them to the Texas School for the Deaf because that was taking money out of the school budget, because the tax money gets moved from out, it would have gotten moved from our school district to their school district. Um, there were a lot of things that were done for monetary, like budget constraint reasons that really made me upset. And parents didn't know their rights, and what their children's rights were in the classroom. And I I felt so frustrated in that moment and in seeing the almost disservice that was being done to the students. And I felt like there was a roadblock every step of the way. And I looked at my husband one day and was like, okay, something's got to give. There has to be a bigger impact. And at that point, I was looking at going to audiology school, so that I could be in a doctor's office explaining things to these parents, like the first person you meet. Um, and the more I thought about that, I still thought about how small of an impact that was. Um, so we moved back to Tulsa at the end of that school year because I just couldn't. My heart couldn't take it anymore. I kept trying to take kids home. I was like, they just need to be. I want to love them. Um,
Come with me.
yeah, that's just it's who I am. And so we moved back to Tulsa, and we had a lot of really deep conversations about where I wanted to go and what I wanted to do. And I fell in love with advocating for my veteran community whenever I was an undergrad because I wound up being our Student Veterans of America chapter leader here on campus. Um, and I realized that I had a voice in that space because that was also my voice. Um, and now that I've had this experience teaching, I realized that both of those things kind of aligned because they both dealt with disabilities. And I started studying for the LSAT. And back in January, I got into law school. I just finished up my first semester. Um, and my goal is to do disability law and policy work, because if you can get in on the policy side, you can change large people, like groups of people's lives versus like one-on-one lives. And that's how that journey started.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. That's incredible. You have got some serious changing that you're going to be making here soon. Like, I can just feel it. Like, it's so awesome. So, so when you got your degree in deaf education, what drew you to that specific platform? Because I have always admired sign language, like myself. I wish that I would take the time to learn that. And they always say that it's easier to teach at a young age if you're wanting to teach your children multiple languages. And
Yes.
so we did do sign language with our littlest one. And I feel like, honestly, that having that other form of communication has made her and our lives like so much better, because at a young age, you have children, so
Yeah.
that like they can't verbally communicate what's going on, but they can use hand gestures, and they can do them in ways that they might not be like textbook normal, but
Yeah.
I know what she needs. I know what she's wanting. I know how she's feeling. And I just think it's amazing in general. So
Yes.
like, I just want to give you like all of the praise for knowing that. And so I'm interested as to what made you choose this.
So across my life, starting in like first or second grade, I had a friend that I rode the bus with, and she sat in the same seat with me, and she was hard of hearing. So she wore hearing aids on both of her ears, which is called bilaterally. Um, and she spoke, but she also signed. At the time, I did not know that speaking and signing at the same time was called simultaneous communication. Um,
Yeah.
and she signed exact English than American Sign Language word order. Um, and I just kind of fell in love with whatever she was doing with her hands, because as a kid, you don't know what that means. Um, and whenever I got out of the military, I knew that I wanted to go to school to be a teacher, and I started in a art education program. Because I love art, if you haven't figured that out by
Yeah.
my like gushing posts and messages. I have always found a deep-seated love in that. And I was standing in studio art one day drawing for a grade, and I got really frustrated with it and was like, this is not it. This is not for me. I don't want to draw for a grade. I want to paint for how I feel. I want to create for me.
Yes.
Um, and I went to the advising office and was like, I don't know what I want to do, but I don't want to do this. Can I just switch to general education? And the next semester, I actually wound up transferring schools to a deaf education program that I had found whenever I first got out of the military, but I didn't want to drive. It was about an hour and 15 minutes one direction to get to the program. So I didn't want to drive that far. But we moved to the town that the program was in because my husband had gotten into school. And I started school, and I was one of the last cohorts from my school to graduate from the undergrad deaf education program. Um, and over the course of 4 years, I met some really incredible members of the deaf community that I still keep in touch with. I still go to deaf community events, silent dinners and stuff. I still am a huge advocate for anyone and everyone learning ASL. I try to keep my skills up, but they're not the best these days because I don't use it every single day.
Yeah.
But I always tell students that they should take ASL because we still have an ASL program that is specifically taught by a deaf instructor here on our campus, which I think is phenomenal.
Yeah.
And it's just really been a cool experience, and it started very young, falling in love with the language, but now it's just a love and a respect for the culture and the community, because their culture is so much different than ours. In our culture, we would tell somebody that we like their hair or their makeup just because it makes them feel good. In their culture, they're very blunt. They're like, wow, you lost a lot of weight, or wow, you gained a lot of weight. And it's not meant to be a rude thing. It's meant to be a like straightforward, like, wow, I'm concerned about you. Are you doing all right kind of thing?
Yeah. Yeah.
That the hearing culture just doesn't seem to get. I also love the like different ways that they can tell stories with their hands. I find it really interesting. There's a few people that like I follow. the McFeely family. The mom created a book called Shay and Ivy Beyond the Kingdom. And it was a book about her daughters and how they could dress up like princesses, but they could also slay the dragon if they wanted to.
Yeah. Oh, I
So
love that.
everybody but the youngest daughter is deaf in their family, so their entire house is ASL. Their youngest didn't learn English until she went to school because that just wasn't the way that they communicated, which I think is really cool. Um,
Yeah.
and their daughter does a lot of acting now, so I watch all of her movies, and my daughter watches all of their like YouTube channel videos, which are all in sign language. So my kids, I mean, my daughter was 8 months old whenever I started my undergrad program. So she has been through essentially all of the years of sign language. And then my son didn't really start talking until he was 3. And I think that that's more out of stubbornness. And,
Yeah.
the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So um, he when he was itty bitty, we started signing with him because you could tell that he was getting really frustrated with communication. And now he signs and speaks at the same time. And if he gets frustrated even at 5 years old, he'll stop and he'll sign what he needs instead of saying it. Which the ease of
Yeah.
communication has been phenomenal. So I think it's awesome that you are doing that with your youngest. Deaf babies who are taught to sign from birth start babbling and being able to communicate at about 6 months old. So you saying that like it's kind of your baby's own version of the sign, it happens naturally like that, even with deaf babies. So I think that's really cool. If I can tell anybody anything, if you have a kid that's born with a hearing loss of any kind, the first place to start is like a community resource, or someone in the deaf community, because even if they have a mild hearing loss, that's going to impact their education, and it's going to stunt their education if you don't do things interventionally early and often. Um, so just find a mentor, find someone in the deaf community to teach you all of the things that they can possibly teach you, because deaf history is incredibly oppressive, but an incredible like success story in how they have changed in the past, I don't know, since the 1880s essentially. Um, and how American Sign Language came to be, and like I could talk about that stuff for hours.
Learning a language like this, learning any second language, especially one that's used frequently in your area, in your community, in America, which America is definitely a beautiful, colorful variety of people. So I don't think you can go wrong with any second language. But I just, it's impactful for yourself. Like I
Yeah.
can imagine, I know how great I could feel because I could say like a couple words to somebody. I felt like so, it was impactful to me. So like doing this kind of work is impactful to the person that's doing it, but also like you said, into the community and making things more accessible for people with differences. I just think it's awesome. And like you said, there are resources out there that I
There
think
are, there are.
I
There's
wish there was
some
more talk about that.
there's some really good resources out there, and there's like online dictionaries that show you how to do the signs instead of like the
Yeah.
static dictionaries.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's been a huge like passion in my life.
Hello, beautiful. I just wanted to pop in here really quick and remind you that if you love what you're hearing and you want to hear more of it, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss next week's episode of I Empower. And if you're feeling extra generous and you would like to give us a review, we would greatly appreciate it. Those help bump us in the algorithm so that more people are able to find these empowering stories to help them. Also, don't forget to check out the art that goes along with today's episode. You can do so at iempower.club or on Instagram at IEmpowerClub. And if you personally feel connected to the story and the art and you would like to purchase a limited edition print that goes along with it, you can do so on our website. As a reminder, all of the art sales go to support the podcast and help us continue this mission each week of bringing you empowering stories. All right, back to the show.
So just having those connections, and I mean, networking is a big deal no matter what you do, no matter where you are. Um, and networking through a community to learn about their culture is
Yeah.
incredible. But I feel like the things that I've gotten to do, teaching and working with veterans, have directly impacted like who I am as a person. So as a kid growing up, I was always told that I had kind of a servant's heart, and I will almost literally give people the shirt off my back. Like
Yeah.
that's just who I am. Um, but a couple years ago, I had an opportunity that was too good to pass up. So I have endometriosis, and we talked a little bit about that. Um,
Yeah.
I was diagnosed at 3 days after I got out of the military. I was surgically diagnosed with endometriosis in 2014, um,
Wow.
where I had been fighting with like pill form birth control and an IUD and all of this stuff to hormonally control things while I was in, because nobody really wanted to believe the fact that like having horrible, huge, awful periods wasn't normal. Which, if you're listening
Yeah.
to this, having a bad period is one thing. Feeling like you're dying during your period and bleeding through
Yeah.
pads and stuff like that, that is concerning, and you should go to a doctor. Do not let somebody tell you that a bad period is just how it's supposed to be, um, because it's not, like, at all.
No. And like, or you're just one of the unlucky ones
Yeah,
that has it rougher than the other. I think,
just suffer
medical
through.
gaslighting is
Yes.
something that a lot of women, deal with and they suffer through. Like, you're going to tell me here in a minute, like how long you dealt with that until you got your diagnosis.
Yeah, so I started my period at, like, 11, and that was so I started my period the day that my grandfather passed away, and it was Halloween. I remember it all very vividly because
Wow.
I was raised in a very, like, conservative household, and we didn't talk about things like that, and I didn't actually know what was going on with my body. And from the time I was 11 on, I never really had like what was considered like once a month normal. I went through times in my life where I would have 2 periods a month and have a couple of days off in between, or I would have no period for a year, and I'd be taking pregnancy tests like every week, even though I knew for a
Yeah.
fact that like I wasn't pregnant. Like there's no possible way,
Yeah.
um, because I just was so concerned, and every doctor that I met me with, well, that's just part of being a woman, that's just part of like what you're going through. When I was in the military, it got to the point that I wound up going to the ER almost every single time I was fixing to start my period. And they give me a banana bag and some Motrin because I'm allergic to any narcotics, um, which is
Oh
great fun.
gosh.
Um, and
Yeah.
they'd send me home and tell me that it would be fine. I just had to get over it, essentially. So, 3 days after I got out, I had an exploratory surgery, where they found endometriosis, on one of my ovaries, on my pelvic cuff, and just like in the cul-de-sac back behind my uterus. And I was 20, fixing to be 21 at the time. I had that surgery where they went in and it's called ablation. So what they do is they like shave off what they can see of the diseased tissue. Um, and they normally say that that will buy you 6 months to a year, maybe 2 years if you're really lucky. Um, and 8 weeks later, I found out I was pregnant with my daughter.
Oh my goodness.
um, which I had always been told that I would never have children. Um,
Yeah.
and so I had my daughter. What happened, so I had a miscarriage before I had that surgery, um, and then I had that surgery, I had my daughter, um, about 6 months after I had my daughter, I had another ablation surgery because it had gotten really bad again, and when I say really bad, like, I I think that that was whenever I started having issues with like my hip. So my left hip has like lesions in the round ligaments in my actual hip. So I started having issues with my hip, couldn't figure out what was going on with that. Found out through a surgery that that was what was going on was the endo had moved into like the tissue around my round ligaments.
Wow.
So that was surgery number 2. At that point, they did ablation again. I wound up pregnant with my son not much longer after that. Um, and then I had another miscarriage about 4 months before I had my partial hysterectomy in 2018. Um, so I had a partial hysterectomy in 2018. So this has been 4 years between my first surgery and my partial hysterectomy, where they took my ovaries and no, let me take that back. They took my uterus and left everything else. Well, what they didn't tell me was that I didn't have something called adenomyosis. I only have endometriosis. So adenomyosis is like the ugly cousin of endo, where it grows within like the musculature of your uterus. So the way that endometriosis had always been explained to me up to that point was that um, the lesions in your body bleed the same way that your uterus bleeds. They shed like the lining of your uterus, which is not what actually happens.
Hmm.
Um, so I am dealing with the fact that I am 24 at the time, had just lost my uterus, which was a really big deal. It kind of sent me on a downward spiral. It really impacted my depression and stuff.
Yeah.
And then to find out 6 months later that I needed another surgery after losing my uterus because whatever they had done had not been done properly. So about a year after that, so this was September of 2018. In May of 2019, I had another surgery, and they took my ovaries and fallopian tubes after a 6-month trial on something called Lupron. Lupron is a chemotherapy drug that is used for testicular cancer that they use on women with endometriosis. Well, people with endometriosis, I should say. Um, that really, it's supposed to go in and medically put you into menopause to
Hmm.
suppress the hormones from your ovaries to see if it will, quote unquote, make the endo stop growing.
Yeah.
What people don't realize about Lupron and about hormonal birth control is that just because they suppress the feelings of what's going on in your body doesn't mean that it makes it stop growing. Um, and that's never something that was explained to me either. So I had my total hysterectomy after I was on Lupron for 6 months. Um, that was in end of April, beginning of May 2019. In November of 2020, I paid $15,000 and traveled to the Center for Endometriosis Care. Well, the Center for Reproductive and Restorative. It's Dr. Kungawasa, sorry, in Atlanta.
It's okay.
And so his office and the Center for Endometriosis Care, along with about 200 surgeons in the world, perform something called excision surgery, where instead of going through and doing ablation, where they just like scrape the top of endometriosis off, they go in and they remove it by the root. So think about like going in and trying to dig up a flower by its root. So you're like actually having to dig in and pull all of that out. Um,
Mm.
so it was a much more extensive surgery than any of the ones before. And during my ovary and fallopian tube removal, the VA actually told me that my endometriosis was gone. Like they saw none of it, it wasn't there. Um, well, come to find out, that was completely incorrect. And my endometriosis had grown so much that it was in the original places that I said, so like my pelvic cuff, the cul-de-sac behind where my uterus was,
Jeez.
my round ligaments in my hip, my left lung was adhered to my abdominal wall. It
What?
was encroaching on my diaphragm. It was strangling part of my intestines. Um, and literally the day after surgery, even still being in like all of that surgical pain, I could breathe for the first time in almost a year. Like
Wow.
I had gotten to the point before surgery that I was vomiting blood because of the thoracic like entanglement that was going on. I was having a really hard time taking a deep breath. Like I was struggling talking. If you had asked me if I could talk for an hour on a podcast in 2020, I would have laughed at you hysterically because I couldn't get through a 5-minute conversation.
Oh
Um,
my God.
and I tell people all the time that surgery saved my life because
Yeah.
I was at such a bad spot, both mentally and physically, that like I couldn't even play with my kids because it was exhausting to even like get on the floor. So I had that surgery in 2020, and it's called laparoscopic excision with PRP, which is it. They take your plasma out before they do the surgery, and they spin it through the centrifuge, and then they put it back in your body where the surgical incisions are, and it helps heal a lot faster.
Yeah.
Um, oh my
I've heard of
gosh,
that.
I had never experienced that before, and I thought that I was going to literally itch my skin off. Like
Oh
it started
no.
like it sped up the healing process so much that within a couple of days, I was like,
You're
everything
like
itches already. Um, so
internally, you can't even do anything about it. I can
right, you
imagine it's like an
can't.
internal itch.
Yeah.
Oh my
So that
gosh.
was a phenomenal experience. I actually, with that surgery, I've gotten to the point that whenever I go into a surgical facility, I want to meet everyone. I want to know who the nurses are. I want to
Yeah.
know who the scrub staff is. Like, I want to get to meet them and know them and them look at me as a person and not just somebody on a table. Because sometimes that
Yeah.
makes them take a little longer and a little extra care if they have like a face with a name. Um,
Yeah.
but like I said, there's only 200 of those surgeons in the world that perform excision because insurance does not pay for it. Insurance makes more money off of repeat ablation surgeries every year and a half to 2 years than they do off of
Shut up.
excision. So I actually was at physical therapy about 6 weeks after I had my surgery, and my physical therapist is super cute in the fact that like she knows that a lot of the women that come to her all have the same issue, but she knows that there's certain ones that if they hear things, they'll say things. So she put me beside
Yeah.
of a woman one day and was like, she was talking to her and she was like, yeah, you said that your daughter is going to go see Dr. Sonervo in Atlanta, right? And I literally was like, wait, did you say Dr. Sonervo? And the woman looked at me and I was like, I'm so sorry to interrupt like what you've got going on. I said, but have you had surgery with Dr. Sonervo? And she said, yeah. So we got to talking and she had had 22 ablations.
Oh
22.
my God.
She was
What?
45 years old. She had had 22 surgeries because no one had ever told her that there was another option.
No, I've never even heard of this procedure.
Yep.
I've never even heard of like what you're saying where they go in and scrape this off. I just thought when someone has this, I guess is the word disease, right?
Yeah.
I'm not sure,
Yeah.
or illness,
Yeah.
that you just lose your uterus, you lose it all.
So
That's
technically, you
incredible.
shouldn't have to lose any of it if it's just endometriosis. Because
Yeah.
even losing it doesn't make it stop. So I currently, there's an 83% chance that after excision, you never have to have surgery again. Like you could be set for the rest of your life. I have some scar tissue on my lung that needs a barrier put in. So I need another surgery to access my lung. But after
Yeah.
that, I should be good literally for the rest of my life. But I have generations of family before me that have had hysterectomies and still have issues. So endo is a genetic disease. Um, And a lot of people are like, oh, it's a reproductive disease. No, it can be found on every single organ in the body, and
That's crazy.
has
That is so
historically
crazy that you're telling me this.
until what, like 3-4 years ago, they thought that it couldn't grow on the spleen, and they went in to do a splenectomy on a woman because they thought she had cancer on her spleen, and it turned out to be endometriosis instead. And so they did a huge research article on that. I read a lot of peer-reviewed research purely
Yeah.
because the doctors that I've encountered don't know enough to know enough, right? So they deal with
Yeah.
the people that they deal with every single day. And when it's something new and something different, they're like, oh, you're fine. Like, you're just, I don't know what to do with you. So we're just going to do what's always been done. Where gold
Yeah.
standard of care since the 70s, Jessica, gold standard of care has been excision. Um, but insurance doesn't want to pay for it. So a lot of people make a lot
Which
of money
is
off of, yeah.
yeah, like, oh god,
That's
that's
a
gonna send
whole
me down a rabbit
other,
hole because like
yeah.
it's gonna
So,
send me spiraling down that rabbit hole because like that makes zero fucking sense to me why an insurance would not cover literally a life saving your life. Like you said, it was growing everywhere, and like how do you have not, I don't know what made you like go into, well, you said they did exploratory and that's when they found that, or that's when they
so
found
the
the endometriosis
exploratory,
the first time.
yep. So I had to send in this huge packet of information to Atlanta, that had like my narrative and how it directly impacts my life and all of this stuff, along with every piece of medical documentation that involved my endometriosis, which I'm going to give you this beautiful visual. So I've got a binder here that's for stuff that I'm doing for a project, but this is a 3-inch binder, I think, 4-inch binder. I have 4 of these filled with documentation
Oh my
from
god.
medical documents from the past 10 years. Um,
Wow.
I have 4 of them just filled. One alone is active duty medical records from the military. And then after that, all of them essentially are like endometriosis records. Some of it's got research in it from doing research on Lupron. Some of it's got research in it for excision versus ablation because I was trying to prove a point to the VA and really didn't get across.
Yeah.
But I have really had to learn to be my own advocate in this space. And I didn't learn about excision until I met another endo warrior who had just had surgery. And ironically enough, we worked together. And she had just started working. And she took a couple months off. And I was like, I'm trying to get a hold of this person. Where are they? Why are they not answering? And they were like, oh, well, she just had a surgery. And one of her grad students was one of the girls that I was really good friends with during undergrad. And she was like, hey, you really need to talk to her about the surgery she just had. So I hunted her down and made her be
Tell
my
me all you
friend.
know. Yeah.
So I was like, okay, so I have so many questions. Can we sit down and have coffee one day and just talk? And she picked me up and we went to have Starbucks. And she was like, I don't know how comfy you are talking about like the intricacies of things. And I looked at her and I was like, I have had so many doctors look at my vagina at this point that I'm willing to, like,
Yeah.
I don't care who I talk to
We'll
about
talk
it.
about
I just need to know what's going on with my body.
yeah.
Because while I was in the military at literally 19 years old, I had a cyst rupture because I also have PCOS. I had a cyst rupture and I wound up being sent to the ER on base. The colonel that came in my room looked at me and essentially told me flat out that I would never have children, um, and that I should just like give up on that idea.
Yeah.
Where this woman that I've met, that I've become friends with, she has worked her tail off to make sure that she has done everything possible for her body to be able to have children. And I think her journey has been so much different than mine, and I really appreciate, like, the differences in our journey, and I really appreciate the differences in, like, the journeys across, the endo, like, space, because there are
Yeah.
men who have found endo in their bodies. There are trans individuals who have endo that fight for the right the proper medical care for normal things, let alone
Yeah.
for having endo and being transgender. Um,
Yeah.
and that's why I went back a while ago and said people instead of women, because that's
Yeah.
kind of a misconception as well. Because you think about BRCA and the BRCA gene and breast cancer, and it can be found in all of
Yeah.
the diaspora of people. Well, endometriosis can be as well. And it affects somewhere around 1 in 10 as the last numbers that were done. 1 in 10 people that were born with a uterus, um,
Yeah.
where it globally impacts as many people, if not more, than people who have breast cancer. And that's why I brought up the BRCA gene, because people don't realize how impactful this disease is and how systemic the disease is, because they're just like, oh, it's a reproductive
Yeah.
issue. It's just a women's
Right.
issue, um,
Mhm.
where it's an issue across the board. Um,
Yeah.
And the more you know, the earlier you can look out for things, especially for people like you and I who have daughters who like
Yeah.
might experience some of this stuff down the road, and you want to be as educated as possible.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, I learned so much. I've heard of this illness. I've heard of people say they have it. I've heard of people having to have their uteruses removed because of it. But I never knew that it was literally like I don't want to say cancer because but like that's it's just what makes me think of the spreading
It spreads like
capabilities of
cancer,
it
yes.
and the rooting of like you said like it just get and I had no idea it
Yeah.
could affect other organs like that's insane that
Yeah.
needs to be like caught so early
It
so early.
it needs to be talked about early and often. So the Center for Endometriosis Care actually will give out like information to school nurses who are
Hmm.
doing like sex ed and like period awareness stuff. Um, there's a lot of there's a lot more research coming out now. Baylor's gotten onto the research stage with it. Um, and honestly, like they don't know the origins of it. So it's speculated that way back in the day, they used to speculate that it was like retrograde menstruation, which
Hmm.
I say with very much disdain in my heart, because it was the idea that it was like backsplash from your period, which I can't quite wrap my head
Ah,
around that theory.
yeah.
Um, Now there's a theory that it is directly tied to genetics. There's also a
Mm,
theory that it's inlaid as your like reproductive organs are like formed in the uterus, so it starts as early as like forming in the uterus. Um,
wow.
so there's some theories floating out there, but there's still nothing definitive because nobody funds the research. Um, because people look at cancer as this disease that's for the entire diaspora, so they fund all of these
Yeah.
things, where there have been people that I've read articles from that have said wholeheartedly that they've had cancer and endometriosis has been worse, um,
Yeah.
which is dumbfounding to me and a little terrifying at the same time. So, but nobody really
Yeah.
talks about the things that go along with having endo. So I also have, at 28 years old, osteoporosis, from the Lupron, from losing my uterus so early, from all of the meds that I've been on. I've got like bone deterioration. It impacts your like mouth health, oral health. That's the word I was looking for. I was like, your mouth thing. Sorry.
What?
Um,
It's okay.
and then knowing it just depends on the kind of medicines that you're on for anything, whether or not they're ototoxic, which means that they'll cause hearing loss. So just being like wholly aware of the medical system as a whole, um,
Yeah.
it's almost a full-time job in itself sometimes.
Yeah, most definitely. So, how, you said that you noticed this from the beginning, like it wasn't a progressive, I mean, I'm sure it probably did progress and get worse, but from the moment you had your period, that was when it was like really painful.
It I didn't know enough to know enough back then, honestly.
Okay.
So looking back as an adult, like, you're taught that you should have a period that lasts, what, like 5 to 7 days, 1 time a
Hmm.
month, and you should be going through, like, I don't know, 5 pads a day or something like that, if you use pads. At 11 years old, I was going through 15 or 20 pads a day, um, and it was
Wow.
bad, and, like, people don't talk about the fact that, like, um chronic UTIs go along with it, because your
Hmm.
urinary tract is impeded by all of that stuff too. Like, it's all kind of connected. It can cause you to have bowel issues. Um, so I've had what they've considered IBS for years, but until I had my excision surgery, nobody ever told me that my bowels were actually impacted by my endo. Um, so just knowing that, like, little things like chronically having UTIs or having intermittent bowel problems as a young kid, stuff like that are things that you should keep an eye on. Having UTIs that back up to your kidneys are a huge, huge sign at an early age.
Mm,
So I always try to keep an eye on my daughter. She's 7. About, like, whether or not she is having issues with her stomach, or she's
yeah.
got a UTI or anything like that. Because I'd rather know earlier than later. Um,
Hmm.
and I feel like everyone should rather know earlier than later so that they can get the proper care as early as possible. Because there's a lot of education out there that teaches that if you catch it earlier, it might not impact as much of their body. It might not impact as much of their, like, ability to do things. So it's really fatiguing, like, having
Yeah.
having that, like, exhausting so much of your body is so fatiguing that there's days that, like, just opening your eyes is hard. Um,
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine the physical, like you said, the physicalness, but also the mental
yeah,
strain that it puts on you. Why, especially when you're young and a teenager and you're constantly having to go and change your menstrual product,
yeah,
like way more than anybody else. Or, I'm not sure how long the pain lasts, if it's like the whole full time that you're bleeding or if it's like the first few days, but like just having that like really like excruciating pain to where you feel like you can't go to work or you can't go to school,
right.
like
And
that's
then
not
having to
normal.
explain that, in high school, like, being like, "Oh, I have to go to the bathroom." My female teachers, none of them really
Ugh,
get it. They're like,
yeah.
"Oh, why are you going to the bathroom again?" And I understand it from the teacher point of view of, like, you should be in the classroom, you should be learning, you should be doing all of these things, but,
Yeah.
um, I feel like male teachers would be like, "There's something in your hand, do whatever you want," and kind of freak out and
Yeah.
be like, "You're holding something. I don't know what it is, but
Yeah.
just go."
Just gonna show it to you. This is what I gotta do.
Um, where female teachers would be like, "Do you really? Like, is that really a thing? Like, do you have to do that right now?"
Yeah.
And that really makes you, like, second guess. Makes you second guess whether or not you feel like you're safe in that space, in that time. But it
Yeah.
also makes you worry because, like me, I I would take extra clothes with me to school because there were days that I would bleed through jeans, and that's
Jeez.
rough. Um,
Yeah.
and it's really embarrassing, but for someone to essentially be like, don't do that right now. Can you wait a few minutes?
Yeah.
Like, that could be so detrimental to, like,
Yeah.
the mental side of it.
Hmm.
And then be like, even now after my excision surgery, there's days that I wake up and there's a theory called uh, the spoon theory, that it's like you have so many spoons a day for people with a chronic illness, And some days you wake up and you have like 6 or 7. Some days you wake up and you have like 1, half of 1, maybe 2. Um, and the days that you wake up and you have fewer spoons, like, it makes it harder to interact with your family. It makes it harder to interact with your
Yeah.
friends. It makes it harder to like convince yourself to get up and go and do things because it's exhausting to open your eyes.
Yeah.
It's exhausting to think about getting up to go pee and brush your teeth in the morning, let alone get ready for work. There's women all over the world or people all over the world who live on disability because they can't work because of this
Yeah.
disease. There's a woman in the UK that recently hit the news because she has been paralyzed from it because it went through her spinal cord. Um,
Wow.
so
That
it's just,
is
it impacts
insane.
everyday life in ways that people never imagine. Um, and so often you hear, well, why don't you do yoga? Or why don't you do this holistic
Mhm.
thing? Or why don't you just drink some tea? Or maybe you
Mhm.
should stop eating this. Or maybe you should go on some sort of like specialized diet.
Yeah.
People with endo already have enough to deal with as far as like trying to wrap their brains around this disease and what it's doing as far as essentially ravaging your body. Um, and as good-willed as some of those statements are, they get really frustrating after a while. Just doing yoga because it helps someone else to free up some like muscular space or mental space or whatever helped them, that's good. That's awesome. Like I am wholeheartedly for yoga and meditation, but as a medical issue, even people with a medical degree don't know that much these days as far as this goes. Um,
Yeah.
so other than asking people how to like support them, um,
Mhm.
some of those other comments get really hard sometimes. Like I have been asked if I have been on a special diet and why do I eat so much like junk food? I love candy. I'm a candy eater, but I'm also gluten free because of my endo, because it actually causes gluten intolerance in your body. So anyone with endo has a range of like kind of doesn't tolerate gluten to doesn't tolerate it to the point that it makes them super sick, almost like celiacs. Um, so those are things that people don't see that people with endo go through,
Yeah.
and they don't think about, and they mean things with like good intentions, but sometimes those
Yeah.
comments can make it feel almost worse. Like, well, they're expecting things from me, or everybody else is doing
Yeah.
it, so I should do it too. So sometimes it gets a little hard, especially dealing with the
Yeah.
mental side of it. So,
I think there's definitely, you know, a learned way, almost kind of putting yourself in that position,
mhm.
you know, and that's what I'm trying to do here with the podcast is just really create empathy and awareness for like everything, because like you said, like I can understand like being in that lived experience for somebody who has never experienced I think when I have a bad, cramp, I go lay down for a little bit and then I'm good when I wake up type situation. But I've never experienced what you've experienced. And so for me, somebody that's like, hey, you should try doing this, or you should try to, like, there's a way to go about it, like you said. And
Yeah,
you don't want to cause any, like, mental anguish or, make that person feel less than, because sometimes the way that you say things can make that person feel like, okay, so you're thinking I haven't tried everything. Like I've
yeah,
literally tried everything. But, just finding a way to go about it in a supportive way is ultimately the main goal that we should all be trying to, if we want to speak on a subject that we don't know about. And even probably, cause I'm sure there's different cases of
yeah,
endometriosis, like different severities. So someone who had it, who may not have had it at the severity that you had it, giving you that advice again, it's hard for us to not have this like God complex,
yeah,
almost like, well, I did it and I got through it and this is what I did. This is what you should do. Everybody's experience is different. And I think
yes.
that that's important that we understand that and that we know that.
Absolutely. I
But
wholeheartedly agree.
yeah. Ah,
So,
oh my gosh. Yeah. Like, so the takeaway from this, I mean, this is incredible information that you're giving me, and I've learned so much. I feel like the takeaway from this on me is early indicate, like, early recognition,
yeah.
and probably, and I'm speaking for you when I say this, is to really be your own advocate when you're at the doctor's office, because medical gaslighting is a real thing,
Yes.
especially if you have probably, and I hate to say it this way, but maybe more so if you have a male practitioner, because all they know is what have learned from a textbook.
Yes.
So, and really probably checking in with yourself, and you
Yeah.
can tell me more. Like, you probably knew that there was something wrong. So
So,
what would be your advice?
my biggest advice is like educating yourself on things, not through like WebMD, not through those things, but like finding peer-reviewed articles and being like, okay, so this is what I was told that it is. So I should, if you're told that something's going on with your body, you should go into kind of in-depth peer-reviewed articles on both sides of whatever is going on and look at like, well, this is what the data shows here. This is what, like, you want to look at the data, not at what some textbook says, because that textbook could have been written 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Um, but also just being like, hey, this is my body. This is what's going on. I get that you don't think that that's what's going on, but we need to do some more testing. Just keep like pushing for what you feel is right for you and your autonomy, because legally they have to give you a second opinion if you want one. Like, if you ask for a second opinion, they have to give you one, um, which I didn't know for a very long time. Um,
Yeah,
and
I didn't know
taking
that.
taking like the mental space for yourself, keeping up with like, if you feel like something's wrong with your body, keeping track of what those symptoms and signs look like. um like, I have a planner that I write down any days that I have a bad day, or headaches that I have, or anything like that. um and it's just a planner that I use for like my regular calendar stuff, and I just keep up with it that way. Where some people have big journals that they write down like exactly what they eat, and then if something happens throughout the day, they can like track it back to like what they ate or what exercise they did, because exercise can be something that flares things up too. So just
Hmm.
knowing what system works best for you to keep up with how your body is doing, um, and making sure that you're checking in with yourself, like you said, like, wow, today that made me more tired than doing the exact same thing yesterday. I wonder what's different between yesterday and today. Um, Even on the mental health side of things, like just checking in with yourself and thinking about where those thoughts come from and where that impact comes from. Um, because all of those things stem from something. And they're
Yeah.
not just illusions of your mind. Where, I mean, the mental health side of things, like, there is something chemically wrong, and like your brain is perceiving it as something.
Yeah.
um so don't construe like those words as like me saying that like your brain is not a
Yeah.
chemical issue. But um you're not just making things up. Like, there are people in the world that have diseases that, where they actually like make things up about their bodies. But if you feel like something's genuinely wrong, keep pushing for your own advocacy, for sure.
Yeah.
Like,
Most definitely. Because I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, endometriosis probably falls into one of those categories of like the hidden illness. Like, nobody can see it.
yeah.
So, it's like fibromyalgia, I think, is another
Yep.
one where nobody sees, there's no physical, like, there's no rash, or there's
Yep.
no, whatever, for us to see. It's a invisible, that's the word I was
Yep.
looking for, invisible illness. So, and just, I can't even begin to imagine what going through life with that. But, with the fact that we're such visual creatures, and people want to say, oh, well, she's being dramatic. She's being a little,
Yeah.
because she's having a bad period. You need to woman up, I think is probably one of the worst things that you could say to anybody.
Yes.
But, so my question, so after having this life-changing surgery, which I'm so glad that you talked about on the show,
Yeah.
because if there's anyone out there that is hearing this and has endometriosis or may think that they do, that this surgery could literally change and save your life. How do you feel afterwards? What did the recovery look like? Are you still suffering from some of the, repercussions of having the illness?
So well, until about a month ago, I had been going to pelvic floor therapy once a week for almost 2 years. And that has been a saving grace. I wish I had known about it sooner. It sounds a little odd, but they work through all of the muscles that hold your pelvic floor together. So anything essentially from like your diaphragm to your pelvic floor, like, and everything in between. Um, and that's been incredibly helpful, just getting those muscles to stop guarding. So whenever your body is in so much pain, your muscles immediately like try to come together and like protect you from that. And what that does is it strains your muscles and it causes them to be tighter than they should be, and all of these things. So just finding a good pelvic floor therapist was the best thing. But it really took. I was I was slow to recover from this one. Every surgery is a little bit different, and the recovery time from every surgery has been a little bit different. Um, but I knew that the slower I went and the more I took my time, that the better the outcome would likely be. So, other than a couple of issues we're having with some scar tissue by my lung, I have been great. I've had less than 10 flares in 2 years, which is incredible. And a flare for me normally looks like having issues breathing, having a really swollen stomach because everything is swelling and bloated and hurts. Um, and most of the time, that means that I'm wearing a dress or I'm wearing stretchy pants because real pants aren't feasible. Um, to the point that my boss, whenever I wear skirts or dresses to work, she's always like, "Are you feeling okay today?" Um, so just knowing like knowing all of those things and looking back on the like recovery process, it took a little longer to recover. It took about 12 to 16 weeks this time versus the 8 or 9 weeks from ablation surgeries. But the money, the stay in Georgia, all of it's really worth it. And just for anybody that's listening out there, Georgia is not the only place you can have the surgery. So there are several incredible doctors in Georgia. There's a lot on the West Coast. There's some in New England, and there's a couple in St. Louis now. So we've got a couple in the Midwest now, and there's a doctor that recently moved to the Dallas Fort Worth area in Texas. But there's these surgeons all over the world, and you may have to travel to get to them, and you may have to pay an exponential amount out of pocket. But just know that like it's worth it. Like, and it will change everything about your body. It will change. So in the past 2 years, I've lost almost 50 pounds. Because my body has finally started processing things the right way again. Um, Instead of just chronically being swollen and holding things in. Um, I can run around the park with my kids. I can go roller skate. I can do all of these things I've not been able to do literally since my kids have been born, um, which is so much fun. Um, and right now, we just started our very first like rec league soccer team.
Oh,
So
yay.
getting to like kick around a ball with them at practice, which I did for years growing up, is really special to me. So
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Oh my gosh. You have an incredible story and you have shared so much knowledge with us and resources with us from, veterans to the deaf community and then now the endometriosis. Like I cannot thank you enough, but I do have a couple questions that I want to ask you that
Okay.
I like to ask all my guests. So we'll jump right into those.
Okay.
What would be the best piece of advice that you would give a younger version of yourself who is in the thick of struggle if you had just a few moments with them?
Um, I was actually thinking about this the other day. So, growing up the way I grew up, I'm the first person in my family to go to college, the first person in my family to go to law school. And thinking about this really makes me tear up because I grew up in and out of the foster care system. Um, Sorry.
It's
Um,
okay.
I grew up in and out of the foster care system. So the idea that I even have my bachelor's degree is a huge deal to me. So the advice that I would give to my younger self is to just keep working. Just keep working really hard, and eventually you'll get what your goal is. Like, you'll get the
Yeah.
great supportive family. You'll get the beautiful kids. You'll get what is the like old school American dream of like being able to chase your dreams. Um,
Yeah.
and I think about how often it is that like it's because of the women before me that allowed me to be able to do the things that I do. So I think about that all the time. And that is such a special question because at 16 years old, I never thought that at 28 I'd be sitting here having this conversation. So,
Oh my gosh, you're making me tear up. I mean, I think anybody and everybody could totally benefit from what you just said to the younger version of yourself. Like
absolutely.
you are so capable of doing whatever it is that you want to do. So,
Absolutely.
oh my gosh. Okay, so my last question is we like to talk about power and not think of that as a bad thing.
Yeah.
How do you think of or how would you describe the type of power that you try to step into every day?
Um, my power is my identity. It is who I am. It is the communities that I'm grounded in. It is the strength that I find at home with my family. It is the ability to help people find a voice that wouldn't otherwise find a voice. I just I find it very empowering to be a female veteran. I find it very empowering to be able to look at other hearing people and say, "Hey, you should learn about the deaf community because their history and their story is so incredible." I find it really empowering to walk around and through the whole month of March, I was wearing yellow at every given moment because to me, it's a huge awareness thing for Endo to really represent during the month of March, along with every other day of the year. Um, so I find my power in like what I can give back to other people.
Ah,
So,
that is so freaking
oh,
beautiful. Oh my
yeah,
gosh.
thank you.
I honestly feel like I could have talked to you for like a whole nother hour. And I'm like, oh
Yes.
gosh, yeah, because I'm very thankful for the time that you have offered me today to be on the
Yes.
show and share your incredible story. Like you have so much going on
Oh,
for you and
yay.
like it's beautiful. It really is. I
Yes.
can't thank you enough for being on and sharing with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's been
Yeah.
great.
I want to thank you guys so much for tuning in today. I want to thank my guests again for sharing their incredible story of transformation with us. I have linked their social medias below in the show notes so that you can give them a follow through their journey. Also, don't forget to check out the art that goes along with each week's episode at iampower.club. If you personally feel connected to the art and you would like to purchase a limited edition print that goes along with it as your own reminder to step into your power, you can do so at our website. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at I Am Power Club, on TikTok at I Am Power Club, and of course, YouTube at I Am Power. And don't forget to like and subscribe so that you don't miss next week's episode of I Am Power. See you then.